a referendum really on the Vietnam War. You had Lyndon Baines Johnson, who with his domestic program, the Great Society, had started to do some tremendous things. And I think I mentioned to you in the last uh, recorded lecture that if Johnson had nothing else to be remembered for, he would have gone down as one of the very, very good presidents. However, Vietnam became a huge sticking point, and that is what he will forever be remembered for. So 1968, the sole issue was the Vietnam War. Bobby Kennedy had tried to unseat him along with other members of the Democratic Party. Then in 1968, with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, we'll talk more about that later when I concentrate on Vietnam, Johnson realized that he needed to pull out of the election. So this was going to be between Kennedy and Gene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey. It comes down to Humphrey and McCarthy because Kennedy will be assassinated a couple months after, as I mentioned before, Martin Luther King was assassinated. You're going to have 1968 is a watershed year for protests, for civil rights demonstrations that turned violent, for cities set aflame, for the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. It was just one thing after the other. On the Republican side, they went with conservatives. They went with Nixon, who promised peace with honor, and he kept saying that he had a plan to end the Vietnam War, but you couldn't find out what that plan was until you elected him. Then he would tell you the big secret. So Nixon in 1968 is going to appeal to a group that he called the silent majority. He claimed that most of the protests were communist inspired, a bunch of hippie, radical, long-haired, unwashed college kids who did not represent the majority of the people. And in a certain respect, it's very similar to the appeal that Trump made in his election in 2016. The group of Americans that a lot of people no longer paid attention to. And in this particular case, you're going to have a lot of people feeling that they had been forgotten, that the headlines and the news broadcasts were all dealing with these college kids, with the radicals, and they wanted a voice. And Nixon was going to give that to them. He was going to practice during the campaign and really during his presidency a strategy called benign neglect. In other words, the civil rights movement, which had amped up during the 50s and the Eisenhower administration, and which had been given legs, if you will, by LBJ, who passed more civil rights legislation than any other past president, he in turn, Nixon, was going to ignore what was going on down south and in other places. So he did not come out as a racist. He just wasn't going to put the power of the federal government in defending those people against racism. And then, of course, there was the issue of the Vietnam War. Peace with honor. He had a plan. Nixon kept saying, I'm the one. He's the one. Later on, maternity stores would start selling maternity tops to women that would, cover their bellies, and on the belly it would say Nixon's the one. Nixon gets elected, and in 1970 he goes a little bit further. Now, let me backtrack for just a second. You have to understand that during the end part of Johnson's administration, there was a peace treaty on the table, and all it needed was the approval of the South Vietnam government. Nixon secretly contacted them. Now, this is while he's running for president, and he begged them not to sign the agreement that when he was elected, he would get them better terms. Now that hasn't come out until rather recently. So Nixon sabotaged the peace agreement. And what happens is more American soldiers will lose their lives in the years that Nixon is president than in all the previous years that the war had been going on. In 1970, he decides to ignore what had been common policy, and that is we will not go into neighboring Cambodia. We're going to restrict the war strictly to South Vietnam, and he orders the secret invasion of Cambodia. When word of this gets out, the country explodes. There will be protests in every city and every college campus, and the most famous of which, of course, took place in Ohio at a place called Kent State, when National Guardsmen, many of them not older than 19, opened fire on the 1,000 or so demonstrators that were there on campus, wounding maybe 7 or 8 and killing 4 or 5. The 4 or 5 that were killed were not members of the demonstration. Most of them were simply walking to class. This is one of the most famous pictures taken where a woman is, or a girl student is crying over the dead body of her classmate. So that was the bitter end of the 60s. And shortly after that, 1972 is another election, and the miracle of miracles, fighting for his reelection, we come up with a treaty to end the war. We'll talk more about that later when we talk about Vietnam.